My guiding moonlight. In recent days, Ludwig had experienced a fatigue of the mind that he thought unnatural. He, along with any prospector, knew well that exploring the unfathomable depths took a toll on the mind and body alike. There had been incidents that had conjured nightmares so vivid that when he flew up from sleep, shivering and damp with sweat, could not for the longest time distinguish reality from a dream. Mental weariness was no stranger, rather a bothersome acquaintance. But lately, the presence of this acquaintance would not leave him be. He could reason and ponder all he liked, but he would always arrive at the same blunt and unfortunate conclusion. He was worn out. Rumors surrounding the typical fate of a dweller of the tomb had in all likelihood been spread among the populace. For few new recruits would fill the shoes of those swallowed up by the dark and unending corridors. Their numbers dwindled as more favored the image of a brave hunter. Nonsense. What else could a man wish for in life? Everyone lives and dies. If the labyrinth was not to bring him death, then what would? He had explored the vast expanse of human history and had seen things many only dream of. It had been both horrifying and incredible. But such is a life worth living. Although, with this new fatigue of the mind, he had his doubts, and perhaps the emergence of dream and life is not as fantastical as it may appear.
Ludwig? Over here?
He turned his head up in the direction of the voice. Oleg stood pointing at a corridor entrance. He had been so lost in himself that he became oblivious to all else, even the calling of his companion.
Sorry, I was a bit distracted. I can tell. With what?
You know, the usual. Oleg nodded, and Ludwig approached the hallway.
Looks new. Let's await the others.
Another void to be explored. A hall of compact darkness with tangled roots crawling over the stone walls. In short, footsteps approached, and Ludwig advanced into the narrow corridor. He held his torch in front of him, with hopes to glimpse something at its end. His footing suddenly slipped, and the very stone he walked on fell down from under him. He jumped forward desperately, but there was nothing to spring from, and he plummeted down into darkness. When he awoke, he did not feel lucid, nor wholly certain on the definition of reality. His mind raced, but everything was dark. His eyes saw nothing, like they had remained closed, even when he blinked rapidly, like he was blind. The prominent sensation he felt beneath his aching body was a heap of stone debris, lying on his stomach and shifting his body, feeling with his hands. His limbs became stiff with pain as he moved them, with soft, echoing sounds of stone tumbling down from the mound onto the floor. Tired of the aching, he decided to simply remain still for a moment. Though there was but small fractions of rubble atop him, he still felt as if he was buried in the deepest suppressing depths. Every time he moved, his body would slowly respond with pain, but he finally rolled to his side, off from the little mound of stone rubble, and landed on the stone floor with a suffered grunt. Now with his face upward, he lay stretched out on the flat floor for further moments, as the landing bump caused additional jolts of pain. He gathered that he fortunately was still intact. A consistent pain in his lower leg and the warm, wet nature of a bleeding wound was the most alarming thing. But as he wiggled his foot and felt for his leg, it appeared to only be a shallow wound. Suddenly he began to distinguish the room he was in. A chamber like many others. He was amazed at how quickly his eyes had adjusted to the gloom. Soon, the luminosity increased to the point shadows were cast. A turquoise light source that was not only growing stronger, but closer. He rolled onto his hands and instinctively reached for a sword that was not there. His anticipated assailant proved no labyrinth guard or roaming fiend, but little dancing orbs of light, about 7 of them. They flew about, close to each other, and danced up and down. He was mesmerized, the most beautiful sight of his life. With their presence, his aching body grew to feel inconsequential. As he arose from the floor, the pain vanished. The light shined on his sword and rifle, who peeked out from the rubble. He turned upward to see a dark hole from which he had likely tumbled down from. He was once more drawn to the little firefly lights, and he wanted to be closer, to touch them. They appeared so serene and harmless. He was disappointed when they moved away from him upon reaching out his hands towards them. Further he stepped, still attempting to gain his prize. Just a touch, but they moved further away. They flew in a shoal like a single being, consisting of 7 little orbs that together shined in an ever-pleasant turquoise light. Then, from a doorway, another light appeared. Another shoal of sprites that the initial ones gathered up into. They floated around in the doorway, circling each other and bumping into one another. Their play was executed with a sort of awareness no normal firefly possessed, and lacking some form of material body. He hurriedly grabbed his equipment and walked after them. They moved further down the corridor, never far away, granting him their light. They guided him into another chamber, empty and dark, with the only illumination being the sprites. The chamber appeared much larger, with no visible roof or walls. The thought of returning to his peers completely passed him by. he could only think of the presence of the little sprites. They led him further into the labyrinth, and he diligently followed. Had it not been for their light, there would only be darkness to see. Suddenly he was frightened by a figure standing motionless to the sides at the light of the sprites. As Ludwig stopped to suspiciously look at the stranger, so did the sprites. It was the shape of a man, not appearing particularly hostile. His body was covered in a tattered robe and face hidden by a large cowl.
Hello?
Ludwig whispered. The man stepped further into the light, old and pale, carrying a strange and macabre thing whose shape was rather puzzling. He held it like a giant club, and it seemed to be formed by several giant bones crossing each other, but it was hard to fully see. Ludwig held firm of his sword, but managed not to act.
Who are you?
The man did not answer him, but started to look around and sniff with his nose.
Who speaks?
He muttered out, clumsily articulate, in a voice that must have been silent for some time.
My name is Ludwig. What are you doing down here, sir? Are you a prospector?
The man mumbled something to himself and raised his voice to make one word audible.
Prospector.
He continued to mumble to himself while starting to feel around with his other arm.
Have you no sight, sir?
Sir. No, sir, no more. And yes, I do. How about you?
I see just fine. It's thankfully very bright here now.
The man stopped with his arm to ponder, turning his mouth in a wondering expression.
Bright. Yes. The dancing sprite.
It struck him how insane it must have sounded, having to explain something so plain.
Sprites,
he replied excitedly.
Yes,
He began to laugh softly and shook his head. Though his eyes did not appear to suffer, they were not fixed on anything.
Yes. Let's go then. What? Where do you mean, sir? After them.
Ludwig turned to the still playing sprites and walked to them hesitantly. The man followed him by the sound of his movement, apparently unbeknownst to the beautiful lights. He walked quickly for blindness and straight up to the door the sprites were heading to. There was an experience in his steps when he walked right past him. He turned to avoid a pillar that he must have known stood there, even in blindness. What else could explain such assured movement? Ludwig continued after them, and the man disappeared in the turning corridor. The sprites remained in the same distance to him as they always did. In the next room stood the man waiting and listening, turning his body in different directions. When Ludwig entered and turned left towards a spiraling stair that ran along the wall, the man immediately walked to him and up the way. He must have walked here so many times he could anticipate where Ludwig was going by his footsteps, as well as knowing the precise terrain. This stranger puzzled him and distracted him from the wonder of the sprites something terribly.
How did you end up here?
The man had stopped at the top of the steps and stood similarly from before, turning to sense the surroundings, but gave no answer.
Do you go by a name?
Valar will do.
A pleasure. But how come you not see these sprites? They are so... well, how should I put it?
Valar did not attempt to entertain an answer.
Have you yourself sighted them before?
More silence, and Ludwig resigned. He followed the sprites into the next room, with Valar closely behind in the narrow passageway. They emerged onto a ledge. They stood atop a balcony in a large open space. The light of the sprites did not reach the ceiling or floor, only revealing the bare stone wall behind them and the initial platform before them. Valar felt with his foot over the ledge, confirming that the floor indeed ended there. He kicked about until his foot hit a little wooden peg. He turned and descended on the ladder he had revealed. Ludwig peered down into the blackness and thought himself to see floor there. He too grabbed the ladder and climbed after. The sprites separated in their mass and spread out around the chamber. They placed themselves up in the ceiling and down on the floor, while one remained by his side, together illuminating the whole space. The giant room gave him the impression of being inside a giant sarcophagus. Several more balconies, like the one they had climbed down from, lacking the ladders, lay further along the wall, in an even level. The typical Thumerian banners hung from the ceiling, and the scones sat along the pillars on the walls, albeit unlit. Valar tensed and became still.
Can you see it?
He asked, and Ludwig looked around to find what he could be referring to.
See what?
Valar pointed out a finger at an undecided target. He hovered as if trying to locate just what he sensed. Just when he firmly set on a large doorway at the opposite end of the hall, a tall figure emerged from the door. It was a robed and slender character, bearing black cloth, shrouding craggy grey armor, and an iconic pointed hat accustomed to witches of fairy tales. The figure's face was turned their way, revealing a skeletal mask and a curved, ornate saber held in its hand. After a moment of examination, it began a slow walk towards them.
Now you see her,
Valar whispered.
I do.
Good.
The figure reached out its arm like it threw something at them. The motion conjured large flames that swept at them like waves. The chamber exploded with light as the incredibly hot flames shined much brighter and aggravatingly than the pleasant sprites. Valar and Ludwig both leapt backwards, and the figure calmly resumed its march forward. It was unbeknownst to Ludwig if he was the only one currently possessing consistent sight. He slowly walked to the side, and the woman did not turn to follow him with her head. She walked further towards the middle, while Valar continued to back away, now totally blind with the absence of the fire. Ludwig sneaked around along the wall with the intention of approaching from her rear. He left the wall and inched towards her, but with about 5 feet between them, she spun around, swinging her saber wide while stepping towards him. Ludwig tried to remain close, but committed to retreat when she surprised him by extending her left hand that conjured a violent burst of flame that almost spread far enough to touch him. Approaching from her other side came Valar, at the ready with his strange club. The queer construct started to fold itself out. He prepared a swing, and as he set the attack in motion, the shambles of bones folded themselves out into a long arm with a giant curved claw at the tip. It swiped in a conscious animation at the pyromancer and struck its mark. She flinched, but retaliated quickly by 2 sweeps aimed at Valar's direction, but missed as he had already jumped out of reach. She summoned a little flame in her hand and frantically slammed it into the ground. Upon its impact, a wave of fire exploded around her. Ludwig saw it coming and jumped further back, but Valar's only indication must have been from the sudden light and was caught off guard. He stumbled, and the witch leapt at him. Ludwig fired his rifle that disrupted her movement. Valar surely heard her flinch, and the arm that he wielded reached for her again. She parried the claw with a clash of her saber like a snake. The arm returned as Valar jumped in towards her side. She was adept to parry its tentacle-like motions, as it continued by the partial command of Valar to strike at her, appearing to retain a partial will of its own. Ludwig came in and thrusted his sword. Her thin physique was hard to hit, and his sword missed slightly and only tore open the side at the ribcage. Not moved by the slash and the pouring blood, she turned his way, causing another combustion from nothing that he retreated from. She leapt away. Her hand grazed the sword's side, and with a quick stroke it bathed in fire. She swung 2 upward swings that sent 2 waves of infernal power at him. Ludwig was sent further away from her, and she attempted to follow, but the freakish arm that Valar wielded halted her. With a slice of the claw that she was unprepared to deflect, it tore up her chest, through the bony reinforced plate. This had her reel, but remained as quiet as the labyrinth itself. With a graceful leap, she dodged the arm swiping from up to down. As she evaded, she struck with the blade that sent more roiling fire towards Valar. He jumped away and quickly brushed off the flames licking at his garb. Ludwig then jumped in towards her side while she still had her attention to Valar, and struck firm a horizontal cut at her waist. She managed to parry the blow partially, which made their sword create a furious explosion at their clash. It caused them both to stumble backwards, him from the fire, her from his attack. In that moment, Valar came running, spun around to give force to a blow as the arm curved around him, and as the blow struck hard, her narrow frame flew over the cold and scorched floor. As she attempted to stand, Valar lashed with the arm, and the claw quickly severed the pointed hat-wearing head from the body. The remains twitched and turned to ash before them. Valar, who must not have understood that they had won, further bashed down with the arm at the scattered ashes, realizing his victory later on. The sprites that had provided sight now moved from their positions and flowed together into the doorway that was traversed by the infernal stranger. Ludwig continued to follow them, and he heard how Valar walked in his steps. The sprites seemed to have grown in number when he entered the corridor. They were everywhere, and he passed them by as if in a cloud, a mist filled with clusters of stars. They floated quietly around him and playfully flew out of his way as he crossed their path. The chamber he was guided to swarmed with the many joyous sprites. Upon his entry, they gently converged over a shrine at the end of the rectangular chamber. It was a stone slab with ornate carvings of an ancient scene, with women praying around the body of a seemingly dead man at the front side. Behind it stood a statue depicting a robed woman with her arms held out, welcomingly over the shrine. Upon the altar's surface, the sprites shone at an object, a beautiful and majestic sword. It was of the greatsword variant and lay partially wrapped in cloth. The statue woman peered down with her head upon him from beneath her hood, like bestowing the sword onto him. The small envoy statues with their famished bodies and grossly deformed heads were praying at her side, turned up towards something they saw behind his back. At the sides of the altar sat two robed men so extensively swathed in cloth that only a small portion of their face was visible, holding staffs and their noses turned towards the sky, scenting the moon. A pattern decorated the lower half of the blade and was undeniably of Thumerian craftsmanship. Valar came up behind him and just stood, waiting perhaps. He took hold of the sword carefully, looking up at the sprites and the statue. He felt he needed their permission in a way, seeing how they had taken him there rather consciously. When they showed no protest, he lifted the glorious weapon from the red cloth that it had rested upon. He held the blade pointed upward, and the sprites started to converge onto it. They clung to the blade, and together formed a layer of luminescent, deep, cosmic turquoise energy that made it grow in size. When he looked upon it, he thought to gaze into eternity. He could stand there and just gaze for eons. He thought to see stars in the blade, heavenly forms and other worlds. It was truly beautiful. Valar too saw it, as he was the one to break his captivation.
So you had your reasons for being here after all. What a marvel, no?
Truly.
But now it is time you all left. There is nothing left for you here, Ludwig.
He tore his eyes from the still shining blade, having reacted to the mention of his name.
Come.
Valar turned and walked away. Ludwig followed, now only guided by the shining sword he held. Valar continued to disregard the use of light, as he constantly walked just at the edge of the turquoise light. Ludwig had to hurry to keep up and maintain the sight of him as he quickly walked through the rooms and corridors. He found it very strange that there were no creatures in this part of the labyrinth, save for the pyromaniac keeper. When Ludwig had lost track of his surroundings and the way back in his eager pursuit of Valar, the man stopped. At the end of a hallway stood a closed door which he pointed at.
There. The comment section. If you get lost, you are not alone. And likely never will be again.
Ludwig bowed in thanks.
Are you not coming with me?
Valar only shook his head and started to turn to walk away.
Wait!
He unstrapped his sheathed silver sword and handed both it and his rifle to him. Valar looked curiously at it.
As thanks. May it keep you in this mysterious place.
Valar took them. Ludwig had, in the heat of the gesture, overlooked the fact that perhaps the rounds found in the labyrinth were incompatible, rendering the gift somewhat useless. But Valar looked excited, and he held it like a veteran, nodding before he vanished back into the dark depth where gods once dwelled. Holy Moonlight Sword. An arcane sword discovered long ago by Ludwig. When blue moonlight dances around the sword and it channels the abyssal cosmos, its great blade will hurl a shadowy light wave. The Holy Moonlight Sword is synonymous with Ludwig, the Holy Blade. But few have ever set eyes on the great blade, and whatever guidance it has to offer, it seems to be of a very private, elusive sort.